heading our way up to the American Revolution, and particularly in the last section, we did the Declaration of Independence and everything that led up to that, as far as just people choosing sides, loyalists and patriots, and talked about common sense and olive branch petition, and how the reaction of the king to the olive branch petition has led us up to this point. Okay, and so now people have chosen sides, and now it's time to duke it out. Now we're going to fight. Okay, so first I want to talk about a couple brothers. They're the Howe brothers. They're British, and these two brothers, one's a general, his name's William, and the other is an admiral, and his name's Richard. But they are the Howe brothers, General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe. Together, they're both British military leaders, and they joined their forces together. Now, if one's an admiral, what do you think he's in charge of? What branch of the military is he in? An admiral. Not the army.
William.
Richard. If you're an admiral, you're in the Navy. You're like a high-ranking officer in the Navy. If you're a general, you're a high-ranking officer in the Army. Okay? But both of these men are high-ranking officers in the British military, and they joined their forces together in the summer of 1776 with the largest British force ever assembled. 32,000 soldiers. 32,000 soldiers. So just imagine one of the largest basketball arenas in America packed with people with guns. And they're soldiers. Okay? In addition to these British soldiers as part of that 32,000, there were also these German mercenaries. What's a mercenary? Brian? That's right. They're willing to fight, not because they are, particularly loyal to the cause. They're fighting for money. They're selling their loyalty to the highest bidder. That's what a mercenary is. And these mercenaries were from Germany, and they were from a region of Germany called Hesse, Hesse. And so, because many of them came from that German region, the Americans called them Hessians. Hessians. So, now a lot of these Hessians weren't the best soldiers. I mean, their heart really wasn't in it. In fact, a significant portion of them, once they arrived in America, like got on a boat and told they were going to go fight. Once they got in America, they were just like, I'm going to go be a farmer somewhere in Ohio. And that's what they did. They just kind of abandoned their post and became eventually good American citizens. But a significant portion of them didn't, and they did fight for money. And as a result of this, George Washington had to match up against these guys, 32,000 of them. And he began to recruit and train soldiers, really not soldiers, just farmers, militia people, when tensions began to rise. And he was able to rally 23,000 men. 23,000 men. And he took these 23,000 men to the defense of New York. How do you think it went? Not very well. Just look at the math of it. 32,000 versus 23,000. If you had to bet your next paycheck on it, who are you betting on? 32. Okay? And you would be right, because 32 is greater than 23. And they were vastly outnumbered. And most of his troops, George Washington's troops, were not very well trained. It's just like, hey, you farmer, you got a musket? Let's go fight. Not very well trained in the art of Napoleonic-style warfare, which is what these guys were doing. So most of his troops had poor equipment, untrained, and the battle for New York ended with heavy American losses. Heavy American losses. So by late fall, after the summer of 1776, after we declared independence, the British had pushed General Washington's army across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. and the vast majority of Washington's men had either been killed, captured, or just went home, deserted. Very few remained. Only about 8,000 men remained. And those guys that remained, their enlistment was going to end at the end of the year, on December 31st of 1776. So, and they were going to go home. And Washington desperately needed to do something to motivate them to stay. So he has to get creative. And so, on Christmas night, 6 days before their contracts were to expire, General Washington risked everything on a bold move. On Christmas night, 1776, there was a very intense storm that was racing across the middle states, New York, Pennsylvania. And George Washington came up with the idea that he was going to lead 2,400 men across the Delaware River, the icy Delaware River at that, in like rowboats. 2,400 men in a bunch of rowboats going to cross the Delaware River in the middle of the night. And by 8 o'clock the next morning, march 9 miles in pitch black to the town of Trenton, New Jersey, which was their objective. This town of Trenton, New Jersey was being held by German mercenaries, the Hessians. And, it was Christmas night, the night before. They were a little, complacent with their, they were a little drunk, celebrating the holiday, German style. They felt like the storm was going to protect them. A pretty intense storm was going to slow soldiers down. And so they were a little hungover, and they were still sleeping it off at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then when 2,400 colonists arrive and mount a surprise attack against them and take 918 of them captive and kill a lot of them and take all their stuff, that is a major moral victory for George Washington and his men, giving them a reason to want to stay. And that's the Battle of Trenton, which is depicted in this very famous portrait of George Washington crossing the Delaware River on his way to the Battle of Trenton. So the Americans, even after the Battle of Trenton, they were rallied by another astonishing victory 8 days later at Princeton, New Jersey. And these battles really turned things around for Washington and his cause. Okay? So, after these battles, winter really sets in and things kind of calm down for a little bit because it's difficult to move in the winter. They don't have tanks, they don't have jeeps, they don't have four-wheel drive, they're walking around. Many of them are shoeless. Keep that in mind. All right, so as time passes and spring comes by, and things begin to thaw out a little bit, the war begins to pick up its intensity again. And we look at Saratoga. Saratoga. All right, Saratoga is in upstate New York. Upstate New York. And the British wanted to retaliate for their losses in New Jersey. And so one of General Howe's British generals, one of his underlings, and his name was John Burgoyne. General John Burgoyne. He's a British general. He was able to convince the British High Command to allow him to try something risky and complex. So I'm going to try to explain it as slowly and as easily as I can. All right. His plan, Burgoyne's plan, is he wanted to lead an army from from Lake Ontario, on the Canadian side of Lake Ontario. He wanted to lead an army from there to Albany, New York. Okay? So from like over here in Lake Ontario, all the way to Albany, New York. Okay? Albany, New York is like on the southeastern portion of New York. Okay? It's not New York City. Albany's right here. Okay? Now he wants to do that, and the reason why he wants to do that is he believes he could meet up with General Howe's troops who could leave from New York City, just to the south of Albany. So he wants to meet up and have two armies converge, two British armies would converge in Albany. All right? And then from Albany, they could isolate and keep New England cut off from the rest of the colonies. They're not going to let anything through from New England and nothing into New England, because Boston's right here. So you got like Lexington and Concord. Boston's in New England. They're going to cut the New England off. That is General Burgoyne's plan, to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. So Burgoyne sets out with his plan with 4,000 redcoats, 3,000 Hessians, and 1,000 Mohawk Indians. He's got about 8,000 people under his command. And his army had to haul wagon loads of artillery and ammunition, and really bogged them down, because the geography of that area of New York is actually just like a swamp. It's very swampy. So they got bogged down in the gullies and the swamps, and their food supplies began to run low. And it was just like moving at a crawl, just crawling across New York. And the Continental Congress, on the other hand, the leadership there appointed a man by the name of General Horatio Gates. He's an American general. Gates was a popular commander, and he gathered militiamen and soldiers from all over that region of New York and New England. And he wanted to try to attack Burgoyne with whatever he could scrounge up. And he does. And guess where he meets? Guess where the bogged down General Burgoyne finally gets caught up to by Horatio Gates? Saratoga. Very good. So when the massed American troops finally arrived at Saratoga, they surrounded Burgoyne. And so Burgoyne had to surrender. And he does so on October the 17th, 1777. So the surrender at Saratoga is a big deal. It dramatically changed Britain's war strategy. From that point on, Saratoga is like kind of halfway in between where they were going and where they, to Albany. It's nowhere near the coast. It's not near the coast. Because, Burgoyne really got slowed down because his food supplies began to run low. Where were the British being resupplied from? Anybody take a guess? Do you think the colonists were providing them with a lot of food supplies? That's right. They were shipping it to them across the ocean. Well, if you're not close to the harbor, it's difficult to get food supplies to your army. And so the new war strategy of the British after the Battle of Saratoga was they're only going to fight the war on the coast. What does that mean for the war? Where do you live? You live here. Were there people living in Virginia here at the time of the American Revolution? Yeah. Were they ever going to be defeated? Do you live near the coast? Where is the only place the British are going to fight now? The coast. Will they ever defeat us? They can't. If their war strategy is to only fight along the coastline, how can they win? They can't. I mean, yeah, sure, they can get the big high dollar, expensive places like Charleston and Jamestown and New York and Philadelphia and Boston, but all the heartland where all the crops are grown, all the indigo and cotton and rice and corn, wheat, they never get all that because their war strategy is not going to do that, and that is a real turning point in the American Revolution. That changes things. Okay, now during this, the victory at Saratoga is a big deal. It's a big deal because of the way Britain reacts, and because we took a lot of their artillery from them, like their cannons. That was a big help. So France continued to be Great Britain's biggest rival in the struggle to build a world empire. And the French were still bitter about losing the French and Indian War. And they blamed Great Britain. They're always going to be salty with the British. So the French, when they lost the French and Indian War, they lost a lot of their territory, almost all of it in the New World. So the Americans wanted to take advantage of this rivalry, and this rivalry caused the French to want to work with the Americans. To begin, the American-French alliance was really done in secret. It was secretive because France did not want to straight up, all out provide us with all the help that we needed because that would incite a full-out war with them as well. So the French recognized American independence and began to secretly cooperate with us early in the war. But it becomes official after the Battle of Saratoga. Because after the Battle of Saratoga, it looks like the Americans just might be able to win. And it looks like the Americans are capable of handling the British. So the French recognize American independence and sign a treaty with us in 1778, and it's called the Franco-American Alliance. France agreed not to make peace with Britain unless Britain recognized American independence. So they became our ally. And without French help, guys, we don't win the war. Because we were cut off. Because the British were only going to fight along the coast. Well, that's what they did. They shut down the coasts pretty much, and we were not able to get anything really in or out until the French came and provided us with all the assistance we needed. Okay. Now, just because we sign an alliance doesn't mean, hey, our alliance today, that means we have supplies tomorrow, right? No. France is pretty far from America. It's a whole ocean away, 3,000 miles. And winter was coming, all right, in 1778. The winter of 1778 was coming. And it would take months for French aid to arrive. In the meantime, who's holed up in who's holed up in all of our cities? The British are living in the colonist house in New York. The British are living in the colonist house in Philadelphia. All the while, the Continental Army is stuck outside, literally out in the cold. And during this winter, when we're waiting for the French assistance to arrive, it was one of the coldest winters in American history. And the camp in which George Washington established for the Continental Army was in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Who has winters? A lot like we have winters. They're cold, they're snowy, they're windy, not very pleasant to sleep outside in. And the conditions there were very primitive, as people lived in makeshift huts or tents. They're not even sleeping in a building. They're not even getting the relief of walking inside and having a fire for a minute. So they were provided little protection from the cold. Needless to say, soldiers suffered from things like frostbite and exposure. One of the surgeons who lived and worked with the army, his name was Waldo, Dr. Waldo. Where's he at? Dr. Waldo, He worked constantly to try to save the soldiers' limbs, but was constantly having to amputate arms and legs from extreme frostbite. Okay? This is bad, super bad news, all right? Of the 10,000 soldiers who started the winter in Pennsylvania at Valley Forge, who braved the wind, the snow, and the hunger, that winter, about 2,000 died. So you had a 1 in 5 chance of dying just from being there. They didn't die from being shot. They didn't die from going into battle. They either starved to death, froze to death, or died of exposure, which is, you have a need of shelter. Not having enough shelter will kill you. So what do you think those other guys that survived did? Like when they see all these other guys dying, what would you do if you were free, like literally never been able to get warm, you haven't eaten a good hot meal in months, it's 5 degrees outside, and you're sleeping outside? You're going home. What do you think they did?
They went home.
They stayed. Can you imagine? Have you ever felt that strongly about a cause that you would put yourself through that much personal misery for a cause that still might not even be successful? They stayed. Very few men deserted from Valley Forge. So, very heroic. And George Washington, he stayed with those men. George Washington might be the wealthiest man in the colonies. He slept outside with those guys. All right, he hung in there with them. Not the entire time, but he was there. Okay, he was there. All right, so another thing, the war is very expensive. All wars are very expensive, and we have no way of paying for it. We don't even have a government. But the Second Continental Congress was not a government. It was like a debate club. That's all they did. They just talked. They had no authority. How are we going to pay for this? And so financing the war got difficult real quick as hard currency, gold and silver, ran out very fast. And very quickly they realized they had to start borrowing money from other Americans. And they did so in the form of these things called bonds, war bonds. So you buy a war bond from the Continental Congress, and then, let's say I go and I buy a war bond for $50. Here's $50, and they give me this bond. And if we win, and the government lives on and survives, I can take that bond back to the government and say, okay, I want paid back, and they'll pay me maybe $60. It's an investment. So wealthy people will buy these things up in an effort to try to make money in the future, an investment. Okay, they're investing in victory is really what they're investing in. In addition to borrowing money from average American citizens, they would also borrow from foreign countries like France, our ally. The third thing that they did, which was a terrible idea, is they started to print money. All right? So the Continental Army, or the Continental Congress, I should say, just simply began to print money up without any backing of it, without any authority saying this money's worth something. And they printed up a lot of it. What does that cause immediately? Inflation. Which makes the value of that money in the tank. It wasn't even worth. Have you ever heard the expression, that's not worth a continental? It comes from the American Revolution because the Continental Congress printed up money. It was called continental money. And so they referred to it as continentals. And it was worthless. People would take it and start fires with it because it was cheaper than firewood. The money was cheaper than, they would burn their money for heat because it was cheaper than wood. All right? So it was worthless. Some government officials even engaged in profiteering, which is pretty terrible and embarrassing. But as Americans, we should probably expect it. Do you guys know what profiteering is?
They did it for profit.
Yeah, it's where you take goods and you hoard them up to make them scarce and wait for them to be scarce, and then you sell them for a good profit. Or you take things that are cheaply made or cheap in cost and sell them at a higher cost to the government because the government has to have them. So people would sell like spoiled meat to the government and feed it to the soldiers because they would get more money for it because they would be like, yeah, I have meat, but it would be spoiled, it would be worthless, and they would sell it to the government as though it were not, profiteering. Or they would take you guys know how the government works when it comes to contracts. Like, who does the government give their contracts to? The lowest bidder. So if Caleb has a shoe company, and Caitlin has a shoe company, and I have a shoe company, and the government wants to buy shoes for all its soldiers. How many pairs of shoes is that? A lot of shoes. So one of us is going to get super rich, right? Because we're about to sell a lot of shoes. And so Caleb says, I will make shoes for all the soldiers for $100 million. And Caitlin will say, I will make shoes for all the soldiers for $90 million. And I come in, I'll say, I'll make shoes for $50 million. Who's the government going to buy from? Me. What kind of shoes are the soldiers going to get? Cheap ones. They're going to get the cheapest I can make because that's the cheapest bidder. And that's not only how it worked then, that's how it works today. They're going to buy the cheapest, okay? So you don't always get, you're going to get cheap shoes, you're going to get defective weapons, you're going to get spoiled food. You guys ready to sign up for the military? I think it's better now than it was at Valley Forge, okay? Just so you know. All right, a lot of people even went and gave a lot of their money for the cause. Like these two guys, Morris and Solomon, they actually borrowed a lot of money on their own and raised funds from many sources to help pay soldiers, because a lot of soldiers hadn't been paid in a long time, and these two gentlemen took it upon themselves. Even John Hancock levied his entire fortune that he had made smuggling to help pay soldiers and pay for the supplies. A lot of people chipped in to help. Okay, but it wasn't just the soldiers who were fighting. There were also civilians at war as well. The demands of war also affected civilian life. When men marched off to fight, the women were left at home to pick up where the men left off. So if the man was a farmer, guess who's a farmer now? The woman. If the man owned a shop, guess who the shopkeeper is? That's right. So businesses, shops, farms, households, everything had to be picked up and taken care of by the women. Even, some women that were single and living on their own, like Benjamin Franklin's daughter, they organized volunteers to do things like mend clothing for soldiers. Like soldiers could bring their pants that have holes in them, and they'd patch them up and give them back. So anything that they could really do to assist in the war effort, that they would. A lot of women would make ammunition in their homes. They'd make bullets. They would take their silver and melt it down and make bullets, because bullets were just round balls then. Just a round ball that they shot out of a musket. Hundreds of women even followed their men onto the battlefields. Like, the men would go fight, and then in the back, there'd be a camp set up with all the women in it, where they'd bring their families and everything. So, a lot of women would do that, follow their husbands to battlefields, where they would continue to wash and mend their clothes and even cook for the troops. A very few amount of women even risked their lives in combat. A few, like Deborah Sampson, disguised themselves as men. You see Deborah Sampson up there? Probably didn't have that tough a time, right? Also a joke. But they disguised herself. She disguised herself as a man and went into war and fought in the Continental Army. Another woman, Margaret Corbin, she replaced a gunner, a person who operated a gun, and then was shot herself in battle. Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, her husband was wounded at the Battle of Monmouth, and he was a cannon. He operated a cannon. Well, he gets wounded, and she's like watching the battle. She runs up and takes his place and starts shooting a cannon. So there were a lot of brave British or a lot of bravery on the battlefield in America and during the American Revolution. Um, you know, Macaulay, she actually, she got a nickname. They called her Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher because she would bring water to wounded soldiers while the battle was still going on. Like they call it, like she'd just be running around the battlefield, and like cannons blowing up all around her. And she got this pitcher of water, helping out, providing basic first aid and giving soldiers something to drink. Called her Molly Pitcher. Even after the war, General Washington made her a non-commissioned officer for her brave deeds. A woman, he gave her recognition. So even at thousands of African Americans even pitched in the fighting, trying to escape freedom, no less. But some went to cities where they could pass as free people. Others lived on the frontier, joined Native American tribes. But everybody's lives were affected by the American Revolution in some way or the other. All right. Okay. So questions on that kind of stuff today?
Oh,
Yes, ma'am.
when Burgoyne, I say his name?
Burgoyne?
What date did he surrender to the,
Is that it?
At Saratoga?
it says he surrendered on October
17th, 1777.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that it? We're done?
Is that not enough?
No, that's enough.
Questions over the weekend, don't hesitate to contact me. I'll have everything that we're doing